Have you ever been in a restaurant or in a public place and you kind of looked around and there was a person that seemed kind of interesting and you wanted to walk up to them and just ask them, like, what's your story? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah.
Anybody? Just me and Bonnie. Like, we're the only two that ever think that, apparently. But I found myself this week, I don't even remember where I was, but there were some people that were there that, weren't necessarily like me. And I just wanted to go up to them and ask them, so tell me a little bit about you and your life, and what's your story? And then I felt like that might be really, really awkward. So I restrained from it. But it's one of my favorite things, is learning about people's backgrounds and their story. And let me tell you, as a pastor, one of the greatest thrills in my life is hearing your stories, and not just about who you are or whatever, but about what God's doing in your life today. That today piece becomes a little bit of an issue, though, doesn't it? Because it's pretty easy once you start to follow Christ to kind of just go with the flow, and then you don't really see Him doing anything in your life today. And if you don't see Him doing anything in your life today, my suggestion to you is, why not? Like, ask yourself that question, because I think God is alive, and He's active, and He is working in you. I guarantee you that God is working in you. So hearing those stories of what God's doing to change you, what God's challenging you in, what He's doing to grow you and to kind of draw you to become more and more like Him, like, that is a huge thrill for me, because guess what I devote my life to? Teaching God's love, developing emerging leaders to see people transformed by Jesus. Like, that's me in a nutshell. And fly fishing. And being a good husband and father. Okay, so not necessarily all in that order. Fly fishing higher levels than it should be, but that's kind of what I like to do. So getting to hear your story about what God is doing in your life, how He's changing you and shaping you and making you new, is one of my greatest thrills. And I would argue any pastor in town probably would feel the same way. Really. Because otherwise we're devoting ourselves to studying and to teaching and to showing our congregations more about who Jesus is for nothing, if it's not making a difference in your life. And I pray that it is. And what I've found is that as you share that story of what God's doing in your life, it becomes pretty powerful, doesn't it? When you get to see God kind of moving in you and through you and changing you and drawing you closer to Him and all of that, like, that becomes a powerful story, doesn't it? Well, God's stories are powerful stories. And we're going to see today that the point of that story is to be told. Stories aren't meant to be shut up and put away and never listened to. And in God's stories, powerful things happen. And people around you, when they hear about what's going on in your life, will be changed by it. And so we better learn how to identify our story if that's true, yes? Whether it's years ago or recent, like, my hope is that you're constantly encountering God and you're constantly building into the story that He's writing in your life. And today we're going to look at a great story to kind of see how we can identify God's moving in this one person's life and therefore translate it to identifying God's moving in our own life. I even gave you a worksheet. You can refrain from filling that out now until I give you more direction on it, okay? But it's maybe self-explanatory enough that you've already figured it out. And therefore, have a great day. We'll see you next time. Oh, no, we'll see you at the chili cook-off. You guys ready to eat?
Yeah.
Okay, regardless, let's get into this. Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, the doctor Luke, who documented all of these different accounts by interviewing specifically people. It sounds like he just sat down like a reporter and asked them questions and wrote his gospel. And one of these accounts that he comes up with is about this man named Zacchaeus. Now, I have a hard time talking about Zacchaeus in the plural because it's Zacchaeus's. So I might just call him Zach for sake of today, because it's easier to say Zach's story than it is to say Zacchaeus' story. Everybody together, let's try to say it, right? Zacchaeus' story. It's not so easy, is it? So now you know the pain that I'm going through. Okay, let's get into this. So, Jesus is traveling, and Luke is kind of telling the story of Jesus throughout, but in this specific case, Jesus, enters Jericho. And he was passing through Jericho. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. I have a hard time even spelling that word right most of the time in my notes when I'm making notes and writing things down. So I just started to abbreviate it just Z. Z is a whole lot easier. So Zacchaeus lives in this town, Jericho. And Zacchaeus is a tax collector. Now there's a couple of things about this right away that would have just stricken a Jewish reader from the very beginning. The word or name Zacchaeus means just, it means pure, and it means innocent.
Really?
Yeah. So Zacchaeus the just. Zacchaeus the innocent. So when you see the very next statement is Zacchaeus the just, the innocent, the pure is a chief tax collector. All of a sudden you've got these two huge diverging issues. And to a Jewish reader, they would have looked at this and go, it would have been striking. It would be a little bit like a young lady raised in a Bronco fan house, dating a Steelers fan, and having to go watch the Steelers game at her boyfriend's grandma's house. It would have been just completely divergent, and it would have struck them pretty hard. Why? People downstairs are laughing. I think people downstairs laughing. Allison's on vacation today.
Oh, and so is Tyler.
That's why I can make fun of them. I'll edit it out of the video so they will have no idea next Sunday what was said here today, okay?
It's more fun to leave it.
Yeah, it could be. They'll know whether they watched it or not. Okay, nobody tell them that I'm testing them this week to see how they do. Okay, so Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. We've talked a lot about tax collectors in this church, right? We know how ridiculed and how horrible they were. Why? Because Zacchaeus is a Jew. And he's working for the Roman government. And he's working for the Roman government to pay for the Roman occupation by charging Jews money, exorbitant amounts. They could tax anything. If you're not sure about some of the things that we've talked about tax collectors, you can pretty much pull up Google and Google Jewish tax collector, and they will explain to you more than you would ever want to know about this position. But what's interesting about Zacchaeus is he's not just a tax collector like the Matthew disciple was. There's a qualifying word here. What is it? Chief tax collector. See, Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector over all of Jericho. So he's like the commander in charge, the tax collector of tax collectors. Like he would be the head of the IRS. Okay? So he would collect money not just from people at normal collecting taxes, but he was also collecting taxes from the other tax collectors. So he's getting a cut of everything that goes on in Jericho. So when we talk later on about how much money this guy had, he was super rich. Super rich. At the expense of his fellow Jews. In order to provide for the Roman government that was oppressing the Jews in Jericho. So he was hated. He was hated more than most. Like, I bet you most people, when the word Zacchaeus would have been said in a statement, they probably would have spit. Zacchaeus. Right? Okay, so he was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Now look at the next section. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. Something in Zacchaeus' life is missing. And he's not exactly sure what it is. But he's hoping that this Jesus guy that everybody's talking about might have some answers. And the word seeking here means continually seeking. It means there's an itch in his spirit someplace that he's trying to satisfy by learning more about who Jesus is, what Jesus came to do, what Jesus has to say. He is intrigued by all of this, and he's hoping that this itch that's happening will be able to be scratched by Jesus. So he's seeking after Jesus continually, all throughout town. It seems like he's following him based on the way that these words are conjugated in the original text, okay? He's seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not because he was small in stature. He's just a little guy. Some of you grew up in churches that sang songs in your elementary and maybe preschool kind of things. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. How's the rest of it go? Find that sycamore tree and see what he could see. Yes, that's exactly where that came from. Okay? Zacchaeus is this little guy. And as a kid, growing up in Sunday school, back in those days they used felt boards. Anybody know what a felt board is? Little cutout figures and the felt, and they would stick it to the felt board and it would stick on there, and then they got techno and we went to overhead projectors. Anyway, so you don't really think about it, but this guy's rich. Filthy rich. Filthy rich. And he wants to see Jesus. And so what does he do? He climbs the sycamore tree to see him. For he was about to pass by where Zacchaeus was. Now, rich people didn't climb trees. Right. Elon Musk does not climb trees. Right? Steve Jobs, when he was alive, did not climb trees. But Zacchaeus does so. So we know that this word right here means motivated. This seeking, he's putting a lot of energy and effort and hope into Jesus. He climbs a tree, he ran ahead, and rich man did not run. It was taboo. You had other people run for you, but you did not run. Jesus was about to pass that way. He climbs up in this tree. Let's see. Ran and climbed sycamore tree, for he was about to pass that way. Okay. Verse 5. So Jesus is traveling. I imagine there's this crowd around Jesus because there usually was. And when Jesus comes to this place, he looks up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. How did Jesus know that Zacchaeus was in the tree?
He's Jesus.
Yeah. Exactly. He's Jesus. And isn't it interesting that the Spirit of God is aware of people that are seeking after God? Yeah. And I would argue that he's aware of people seeking after God because I believe that God is the one that prompts us to seek him to begin with. So God's after this guy. Zacchaeus doesn't know. He just knows he's got this itch and he's trying to satisfy. He's going through life going, man, I've got all this wealth and all this fame, and yes, I'm hated by others, but I don't care because I can buy them. Yet, life is unfulfilled. Life is unfulfilled. So Jesus looks up and says to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today. Now this word stay, we know, based on this culture, that hospitality was a huge deal. You didn't just eat lunch with people to eat lunch with people. When you ate lunch with people, you were saying, I accept you, and I call you friend, and that person that's like a friend is like a family member to me, and so I'm drawing you into, I'm affiliating my life with, and so a lot of times the Pharisees, when they saw Jesus eating meals with people that weren't like them, they would throw stones at Jesus and say, you're eating with these terrible people. So the fact that Jesus says, I want to stay at your house, means he's going to go and eat with Zacchaeus, but he's also going to stay overnight with Zacchaeus. So imagine how much worse it would have been perceived by the Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders at the time. You're what? Jesus? You're what? Verse 6, so Zacchaeus hurries down, and so he hurried and came down and received Jesus joyfully. Again, sometimes our words are a little bit underemphasized because of the constraints of our language. This word right here, Zacchaeus was emphatically joyful. He's over the moon. It would be like the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes guy showing up at your house saying, you just won $1,000 a day for life. That'd be pretty exciting, wouldn't it? For whatever, I mean, that pales in comparison to knowing Jesus, by the way. But this is as if Zacchaeus just won the jackpot. Like Jesus, this man that he's seeking after, this itch that he's trying to solve, hoping that Jesus has the answers, saw him in the tree and says, I'm staying with you tonight. There's probably, I don't know, 100, 200, maybe more people around Jesus at this time, but he singles Zacchaeus out, who's different from everybody else. I'm staying with you tonight. And Zacchaeus is like, heck yeah, he is! I just won! And when they saw it, they all grumbled. Who's they? The crowd. Yeah. Probably the disciples were probably exactly in this mix. The Pharisees, the people, the religious leaders that have a certain way of doing things, right there grumbling. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. We were at a different church last Sunday morning, because that's what pastors do when they go on vacation. They go to other churches. You know, it's weird. But we do. And so one of the pastors that we saw during that 2 weeks last week, he was saying, you know, there's two responses typically to this kind of situation. There's the Pharisees that look at sinners and go, you're wrong, and they hold them in contempt. And there's Jesus who looks at sinners and goes, you're wrong, but he has compassion. Contempt versus compassion. And we know that we're wandering the road of religious legalism whenever we view others and their sin as contemptuous. And we know that we're walking the way of grace in Jesus and love when we see other people and we hold them in compassionate emotion. I mean, we agree with what they're doing. Contemptuous versus compassionate. They're grumbling. Jesus is going to be with this sinner. Can't believe he's staying there. Can't believe. Well, what happens next? So Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord. Again, this word stood is the same word used of the priests in the temple when they would stand before God and provide the sacrifices necessary to pay for the sins of the people. Okay? This word stood means like religiously in some kind of formal kind of stance. So I imagine that Zacchaeus has probably got this pretty big house. There's probably a lot of people in it. And he sees what's going on and people are grumbling and complaining about Jesus eating with them. And he's like, hey, ding, 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 I have an announcement to make. Okay, very formally and very, very process-wise. And he says out loud here, I'm going to get on the same page. Behold, Lord. He's seeking Jesus and now he's calling him what? The half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of everything, I restore it fourfold. He has how much money and resources at his disposal? He gives half of it away. And he says, if I've defrauded anybody, right? He's a chief tax collector. You can guarantee he's defrauding people. And what does he say? I'm going to return it fourfold. Now, the Old Testament law required 2 times the amount. Like if you stole something from somebody, you had to restore 2 times the amount. But he's voluntarily volunteering, same thing, 4 times repayment to anybody that he's defrauded in Jericho, a large city, one of the oldest cities in Israel. He takes the stand before everybody in the room because he publicly wants to confess to them that his relationship with Jesus has changed. And because of the faith that he has in Jesus and the way that Jesus is going to take care of him in the future and be Lord over his life, he's going to follow him with everything. He says, I am going to make a statement here and restore the things that I've taken unlawfully. Well, it was lawful, but wrongly, unjustly. His new relationship with Jesus is evidenced by a change of attitude and behaviors. Do you see that? New relationship with Jesus. How long did it take him to get to the point where he's like, I think I'll give half of my goods away. How long was that? Immediately. It was immediate. An immediate change. Now I wish that everything in my life that I've encountered Jesus on changed immediately, don't you? That I knew was wrong or that I knew wasn't in line with his way and how he looked. Don't you wish? That doesn't always happen that way. But in this case, man, Zacchaeus has an immediate and drastic change. His goals and values, his purpose, and his identity changes because of Jesus. Isn't that awesome? Okay, let's keep going here. Jesus says to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he's also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Today salvation has come to this house. Why did salvation come to this house? Because Zacchaeus did a bunch of stuff for Jesus to get right with him? I mean...
It's because Jesus showed up.
Okay.
Zacchaeus didn't earn his salvation.
Zacchaeus did not earn his salvation. There's no way, no matter what you do, Zacchaeus could have given everything away. But if he didn't call Jesus Lord, he wouldn't have been saved. Jesus would not have made this declaration. See, faith is what creates salvation. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Why? Because you got to believe in God to know that he exists. Like, you have to start someplace. So Zacchaeus seeks after Jesus. Jesus comes to his house. Yes? People start grumbling, and Zacchaeus is like, man, there's something different about this guy. He's not just a man named Jesus. He's now my Lord. Everybody, I got to tell you this story. He's my Lord, and if I've wronged you, I'll return it to you 4 times, and I'm going to give half of everything away because I've just encountered Jesus. See that? And Jesus says, because of that, not because of what you're doing in response to knowing me, but because you've believed in your heart that I am your Lord, you were saved. You've got to get that right, folks. Because anytime you find yourself going, if I could only do this better, if I could only stop doing that, if I could only, that Jesus would love me more. No. When did Jesus love Zacchaeus? On the road, right? When he saw him in the tree. Probably even before that. Not because of what Zacchaeus did. That's not what brings salvation. Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. You know what that's called? Gospel. That's what that is. And this is a beautiful picture. It's part of God's story, right? The gospel story is God saying humanity needs a Savior. I will come to them and provide for them what they need, what they cannot provide for themselves. I will come. And what do we see here? Jesus came seeking after the lost sheep. Zacchaeus is lost. And now he's saved. That's the gospel. So if you're ever unclear, just remember, God came to seek and to save the lost. Which one of I was before I met him. And Zacchaeus has got the same story. So Zacchaeus is going to tell everybody, hey, look, I was lost, but now I'm found. I was seeking after stuff that was always unfulfilled until Jesus came to town, and I knew I had to know him. Imagine, Luke's writing all this stuff down. I bet you he talked to Zacchaeus one-on-one. He's like, Zacchaeus, tell me your story. And Zacchaeus is like, you wouldn't believe it. I used to be the chief tax collector in all of Jericho, ripping off people left and right. But Jesus changed me. Changed me. Now, what's interesting about Zacchaeus that the scriptures don't tell us is that he became a leader in the early church. Clement, the bishop of Alexandria, which was kind of the first followers after the disciples, the bishop of Alexandria mentioned Zacchaeus, that he was continually faithful in the growth and nurture of the Lord, and he served Jesus to the end of his life with distinction, and being elevated eventually to the role of the bishop of Caesarea. Zacchaeus, this chief tax collector. I mean, you know he's got some kind of aptitude because he's a chief tax collector. Either he's really good at being evil Or he's got some brains in his head and he can figure out how to make things work out. Well, he eventually gives his life to Jesus, follows Jesus with everything, gives away half of his stuff, and becomes a bishop someplace. Isn't that cool? Okay. Glad you think so. So, I said earlier that your God story is powerful. And if we're going to recognize and be able to share our God story with people, because the point of a story is to be told, then we better learn how to identify some things. And what a better place to start than with Zacchaeus' story, because it's a pretty cool story, isn't it? So what do we learn from Zacchaeus' story that helps us eventually identify ours? A few things. Zacchaeus' God story starts with this underfulfilled part of his life. Okay? Either it's underfulfilled or he knows it's wrong, or maybe there's some guilt or some shame going on in his head and his heart. Something's not right. Something's not right. And he recognizes that. Jesus says, man, the healthy don't need the doctor. It's the sick who needs the doctor. But if you don't know you're sick, you don't always know you need the doctor, right? So hopefully, as God is moving amongst people, they begin to recognize that something's missing. Maybe there's some unhealth that they'd like fixed. And so what do? The very next thing that Zacchaeus did is, once he recognized, man, there's something missing, so this Jesus thing, it's kind of intriguing to me. I'm kind of interested in knowing what's going on there. It might just be a little curiosity. And he's going to keep seeking after Jesus. He hears Jesus is coming in town. He's interested. He's going to seek after. He's going to keep seeking after. And that word seeking in that original verse that we looked at is this repetitive, like constantly looking for Jesus until Jesus calls him out of the tree. Okay? So, Jesus is, there's an intrigue or curiosity. We're going to look at how this applies to us in a second. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But Zacchaeus is changed by Jesus. I don't have all of the details of how that happened, what the conversation was. I'm imagining around the dinner table when people start grumbling and complaining. But probably Zacchaeus either recognized it immediately that the character of this Jesus guy is worth giving myself completely over to. Or they had some kind of conversation or interaction and Zacchaeus asked questions and Jesus answered them around the table. We don't know. But Zacchaeus was changed by Jesus. Because he takes a very public stance and says, Lord, in front of half of everything I give away, and if I've defrauded everybody, I return it fourfold. This means that Jesus has changed Zacchaeus' attitudes, his behaviors, his values, his goals, his intentions, his motivations. Everything is different with this guy now because of what he did. He was greedy, and now he's giving. See? The response to Jesus' invitation. He took a stand, and sometimes I abbreviate it up here so that it fits on the screen, and then I just completely forgot what that was all about. But the response to what Jesus did is Zacchaeus then begins to identify all of the changes that he's making in his life, right? Half of all of my possessions I give away. And if I've defrauded everybody, and what we learned from Clement is it goes even beyond that. Like, we don't know all that went into Zacchaeus' life after this, but I guarantee you the trajectory of his life changed entirely. And so his response to how Jesus changed him is his life will never be the same. His motivations, his goals, his attitudes, all of those things are changed, right? And so now he lives with a new purpose. Values, goals, all of those things. Okay? So, something's missing. I wonder what Jesus says about this. Jesus is changing my thoughts, opinions, attitudes, behaviors, motivations about this. Here's how it makes a difference in my life. Here's what's changed in my life. So Zacchaeus' God story and our God story can follow the same kind of bullet points. Let's put ours up there. In what way has your life been unfulfilled? In what way did Jesus intrigue you, or what he said about something caused enough curiosity that you went to him and said, okay, I'm struggling with this issue in my life. In what ways has he spoken into you that issue and said, you need to change here? And in what ways have you responded to the invitation that Jesus made to change? Let's put this into more of a specific example. Last week, when Josh was sharing in his story, he hit the whole idea of giving pretty hard. It's pretty hard to give when you're facing $3 million worth of hospital debt or whatever it was. 3 million? 1.8 million? 1.8 million. Get my millions mixed up sometimes, right? When you are facing that kind of debt, it is really hard to be generous with what you have. But he said, you gotta be generous anyway. Here's what I'm telling you. At some point, in Josh's story that he shared last week, there was an underfulfilled part of his life. How in the world, when you get this bill, do you plan on paying this back? Remember, he said that he quit his job to be with his daughter in the hospital. That's a pretty big bill, by the way. That ain't easy to pay back. He was joking he's going to pay $10 a month for 4,000 years, right? How am I going to do this? I don't know. Something's missing. God, you've got to show up in this. So, in his life, at some point, I promise you, he's had some kind of encounter with learning how to be generous because God's been generous with him. And he's explored this idea. Well, Jesus has been incredibly generous with me. He asks me to be generous. It's challenging, but I'm going to do it anyway. And he shares with us, like living with these new purposes, no matter what I'm facing, I'm going to be faithful. No matter what I'm facing, I'm going to be faithful. Now, finance is one thing. It would work with fear. It would work with the fear of losing your daughter. Man, I'm afraid that something bad's going to happen to her and we're going to lose her. Well, what does Jesus say? He says that he is the life worth living. That he, oh man, remember what we learned a couple of weeks ago? Your will be done. If God's will is to take a loved one, man, how do I deal with that? God, how can I follow you and still believe in you, knowing that this might be really hard? Well, Jesus can do that. He can get you through that. Do we trust Jesus with our daughter in the hospital room? Probably more so on some days than others. But we're responding to his invitation of trust me. Will you just trust me, Josh? Trust me, Bonnie. Trust me. Trust me. Now, we know that the end of the story was great and that she's alive and well. And she's got a little spunk and spark, I would say. Right? So, how do we live with the new purpose? Man, he stands up in front of a group of people and he says, let me tell you my God story. And it has power, doesn't it? Because of God, not because of Josh's great faith, Josh's great generosity. No, all of this happens because of God working in us and through us. So how do you find your God story? Because as you encounter God, the story of how he's changing you becomes powerful, especially when other people are seeking Jesus. Because their lives are underfulfilled. And they're curious about what makes a difference in your life. How can you have such confidence in the God that you say that you serve? Well, let me tell you my story. Because here's how he's shown up in my life again and again and again. You might not be up in a tree that he's calling you out of. You might not be in a hospital room with a daughter on life support, or what it looked like to me was like I'm no nurse. You might have bills and feel like you don't have enough to give. You might have greed in your life that you're like, I'm just needing more and more and more, like Zacchaeus did until he encounters Jesus. Whatever it is, like, what is your life like before Jesus intervened in that area? It doesn't have to be big. What intrigued or challenged you about Jesus? What were you looking for that you were hopeful that he really would come through on and did? Like, what is it that he offered you that made the difference in this issue that you felt underfulfilled about? And how were you changed by it? What difference is he making in your life right now? I'm going to go a little long because this is important. And you're my church family, and you love me. My life before Jesus was a wreck. I was living for myself, doing my own thing. What intrigued me or challenged me about Jesus was all the things that he kept saying. He kept saying in his word that I would read and that I knew because I grew up in church. But I got really turned off to it over the years. What intrigued and challenged me about him was that he said again and again and again in his scriptures that life with God is an adventure. It is an adventure that's worth living. And my life at the time, it was stupid. I mean, I tried to find adventure in all the wrong places, people, and things. And it was unfulfilling. It never scratched that itch that I was looking for in my life, right? And so at one point I'm sitting down with Jesus going, okay, God, you're so big. You think that life with you is an adventure. I'll give you my life and let's see what you do with it. I mean, I don't recommend this, but I challenged him and said, let's see what kind of difference you make. How was I changed by Jesus? The more I got to know him, and the more I began to live for him, the more adventurous my life became, and it became adventurous to the point that I was like, could you stop for just a second? Like, let me breathe here a little bit, because I was doing things that I knew I had no business doing. I was Zacchaeus. I had been doing life my own way. And at some point said, okay, Jesus, let's see what you got. And he's like, okay, follow me. And the next thing I know, I'm going from being a chief tax collector to being a bishop of Caesarea. Not really, just like...
Metaphorically.
Thank you, metaphorically. I lost the word for a second. Metaphorically. I mean, a little bit like a clampet shopping on Rodeo Drive. I mean, it dates me a little bit there. Look it up. But in all of that, like, Jesus changed me. And I'm sitting in front of Sunday school rooms in a church years ago, teaching people that I knew were a lot closer to God than I had been recently. But I had given myself completely over to it. And it was incredibly intimidating. And I would be grumpy and agitated and angry at my entire family on the drive into church because I was so scared of teaching people about Jesus. What difference is he making in my life now? Well, this doesn't just happen once, right? It doesn't just happen once and done. Set it and forget it. That's not how this goes. Each and every day of life, there's another area. Some I overcome quickly, some I battle with regularly. That I have to surrender back to him and say, oh man, I've gotten off the track here. My life is not like it should be. I know it's not. And so what have I done? I know what your word says about this, and this is a challenge for me, Jesus. So help me with this. How am I changed by him? He continually pours his grace over me. He continually helps me, sends me things to get over these kinds of issues. And what difference is he making? Man, every day he pulls me up. And by grace, every day, he makes me new. Okay, so you've got a piece of paper on a chair that you're sitting on. Hopefully you picked it up before you sat on it. It might be a little wrinkly. There's some pens scattered around, and you get the opportunity to walk through this in your own life. As we close out here, we're going to do our normal stuff, our new normal, right? We've got the giving box. We worship through giving. That's another way that Jesus changes us, right? We've got that over there. We've got communion in the back by the prayer wall now. We changed it around a little bit to give us a little bit more space. And we've changed the prayer wall a little bit. You can see the thin blue line on there. The stuff below that line, those are your private prayers, things that you don't want shared with anybody. Continue to write those down, roll them up, and stick them in the bottom part of that. But you know that we have a prayer team that meets every other Wednesday night. And during that time, we pray for you. We pray for you. And if you need prayer and you're not sure how to get a hold of anybody that's on that team or it's a little uncertain, I want you to write that prayer request down, roll it up, and put it on the top part, the public part. Everything above that blue line's public. And so we will read those over and pray over them. We're not going to advertise them on Facebook or anything like that. We're just going to, in our little prayer team group, pray over those. And so if you need prayer, that's a great way to do it. Communion's in the back, just like normal, dip and dunk back there. And you can spend the next few minutes as we kind of sing and wrap things up and close together, working through your story. Why is this important? Because the point of the story is to be what? Told. The point of the story is to be told. If all of the authors and all of the generations wrote down their stories and hid them away, we would be poor for it. The point of a story is to be told. If we didn't know about Zacchaeus, we would be poor for it. But the point of the story is to be told. And so we do what Jesus does. What did he do? He went. He went to the ugly people. And so we too go to the ugly people. Because I was ugly once. Some of you would argue I still am. But I'm talking about the difference between my heart and my face. Right? One of the stories to be told, so we have to know our story. Because stories are powerful. We have to take our story with us. So as we encounter people that God is creating that itch in, we know how to speak to them. Why is this important, folks? You know. Because the kingdom of God will be better served with more people in it than less. And we are his hands and feet. He can use you and he wants to. So what's your story? What's your story? What's your God story? Who were you before? God just recently challenged you on something. And who are you now that you've adjusted your life to him? Who are you now that you said, Lord, I want to follow you with all of my heart, soul,